Stay until the end, because what we will reveal today is profound. And to seal this moment, we will have a special prayer for protection and reflection. It is an invitation to the soul that seeks light in the darkness. Man, the story of Nicodemus is one of those things that really grabs you. The turnaround in the guy's life is so absurd that you start thinking, dude, how did that actually happen? We, looking from a distance, can see the roller coaster of emotions he went through, the shock it was. He was Nicodemus, one of the most important men in Jerusalem, a member of the Sanhedrin, like a Supreme Court minister at the time, a respected Pharisee, super knowledgeable about the scriptures. His life, around 33 AD, was one of iron stability. He owned olive fields that would sustain generations, imposing properties in the capital, and most importantly, a name that opened any door. The guy was the definition of power, of having life all figured out. But his mind was no longer the same. That meeting with Jesus in the middle of the night, which he tried to forget, had planted a seed of doubt, a strange fear that didn't come from thieves or illness, but from having to choose between the life he had and a truth he felt was greater. He tried to fix things, gave a weak defense for Jesus in the Sanhedrin, and then, in a moment of courage he didn't know where it came from, he helped bury the said Messiah. This act, for him, was like a silent cry of loyalty, but for the Sanhedrin, especially Caiaphas, it was like pressing Nicodemus's self-destruct button. The narrator saw that, deep down, Nicodemus felt that things were going to go bad, but he couldn't regret what he had done. It was a strange peace mixed with dread. His life of opulence, of dinners where he was the main attraction, was about to turn to dust, and he had a pressure in his chest telling him so. The Sanhedrin was not composed of amateurs, far from it. They were old foxes in the art of using the law as a weapon, and Caiaphas was the master of it. They weren't going to simply expel Nicodemus and ruin his life with just any scandal. No. The plan, which Nicodemus felt in the air, was much colder, more surgical, and in a bizarre way, totally legalistic. They didn't want the vengeance of a punch. They wanted to destroy him irreversibly, using the very rules he so valued. The narrator watched Nicodemus sitting at the table, trying to read a scroll of tithes, but his vision blurred and a chill went up his spine. He had the feeling that at that exact moment, while the morning sun weakly hit the columns of his courtyard, someone was scouring every bit of his financial life, every tax line, every transaction of cattle and wine he had ever made, looking for the perfect flaw. The machine started grinding in the middle of the morning. Nicodemus was in his library, a place smelling of cedar and ancient scrolls, which had always been his safe harbor. He was trying to convince himself that it was impossible for them to find anything wrong. His honesty, after all, was one of his hallmarks. But suddenly, an icy dread hit him. These were the accusations: diversion of sacred tithes and financial support for seditious people. The Sanhedrin had achieved what seemed impossible. They found or planted evidence that he, the pillar of orthodoxy, had diverted money from the temple and, worse, financed the Nazarenes' followers. Nicodemus felt his blood run cold, and the narrator saw in his eyes the recognition of the trap. It wasn't about the truth. It was about the appearance of the truth, and they had built a castle of lies with bricks of law. The cruelty of the thing lay in its impeccable legality, in the way they transformed personal revenge into divine justice and public order. He realized that there was no defense. The game was over, and he hadn't even realized he was playing. The final blow did not come with shouts or soldiers breaking down doors, but with the oppressive silence of bureaucracy. An official from the Sanhedrin, with a face so neutral it looked like a marble mask, appeared late in the afternoon. He didn't bring guards, he brought sealed scrolls with the heavy seal of the authorities. Nicodemus smelled the parchment, a mixture of ash and vinegar, and the narrator saw that that foul odor was the smell of total loss. The edict, written in cold and ruthless legal language, determined the legal confiscation of everything. Fields, vineyards, the houses he had inherited from his grandfather, even the silver and gold reserves he kept in an underground safe. He lost the right to trade in the temple, which was like the Wall Street of the time. His name was erased from the records of major donors. Nicodemus tried to read, but the characters seemed to spin. It only sank in when the official said, without raising his voice, "Your house and property will be sealed at sunset, sir." It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration of fact, of a sealed destiny that had been fulfilled in less than a day. Nicodemus's misery, we saw, was not only financial, it was public humiliation disguised as law. That man, who once walked through the streets of Jerusalem and saw people bow down, now felt like a ghost. As the sun began to set, painting the sky a desperate orange, his own servants, those he paid handsomely, began to look at him with a fear mixed with pity, hurriedly collecting his few personal belongings before the seal fell. The creditors, who until the morning licked his feet, disappeared. Nicodemus tried to send a message to a close friend in the Sanhedrin, one he considered loyal, but the messenger returned with the news that the friend was not home and had no predicted time of return. The narrator saw Nicodemus's face empty out, the skin that previously had a healthy glow, now grey. He realized the cruel irony. He had lost everything to the system he defended and was, for the first time in his life, completely alone. His Pharisee pride was being crushed in a way he never imagined. The real dread arrived in the darkness, with the thin Nisan moon barely illuminating the narrow alley where Nicodemus had to flee. He had managed to escape through the back of his own house, disguised and with a ridiculous linen bag containing an extra tunic, a ceremonial dagger that seemed useless now, and a few coins he kept in his belt for silly emergencies. The narrator saw his figure, previously imposing and full of dignity, now hunched over, his shoulders curved not only by the weight of the years, but by the weight of the disgrace that had fallen upon him. He was a fugitive in the city he had helped govern. The fear of being recognized was something palpable, a cold sweat that ran down his forehead even though the night air was cool. He feared not the imprisonment of a common thief, but the public humiliation of being dragged through the streets, having his Pharisee mantle torn, being spat upon by the same crowd that revered him. Every shadow that moved, every dog bark at the end of the street made his heart skip a painful beat in his chest. Nicodemus tried to convince himself that it was just one night, that he would find a distant relative the next day, someone who would have the courage to ignore the Sanhedrin and give him shelter. But deep down, he knew that the sentence of isolation was more potent than any wall. No one would risk themselves for a man that power decided to destroy. He walked for hours, aimlessly, feeling the friction of the leather sandal on his feet, a strange and deeply uncomfortable sensation for someone accustomed to being carried in litters or only walking in well-kept courtyards. There came a point when hunger and thirst became a real torment, not an abstract complaint. He saw the door of a simple house in the poorest part of the city, where the Am Ha-Aretz lived, the people of the land, the poor and ignorant whom he, in his previous life, looked upon with subtle and distant condescension. Nicodemus, the scholar of the law, the member of the Sanhedrin, was totally dependent on someone he considered socially inferior. The irony cut deeper than any dagger. He sat on the cold stone steps of an abandoned warehouse, and the narrator saw that his hands trembled not only from the cold, but from the loss of identity. He was no longer Nicodemus, the master. He was just a frightened old man. It was in that moment of naked despair, when he seriously thought about giving himself up and ending the torment, that he saw a shadow approach. It was not the patrol. It was a woman in a dark shawl, with a face he couldn't distinguish in the gloom, but carrying something that smelled of fresh bread and lentils. Nicodemus's heart stopped for a second, and he felt a strange reverence for that anonymous person. A human being risking her own safety for someone who, until then, despised her. The warmth of the bread in his skinny, trembling hands was the first real thing he had felt that terrible day, a sign of life coming from where he least expected it. That woman, who seemed to have come out of nowhere and returned to nowhere, was not a heroic figure in a bright cloak. The narrator saw that she was simply a mother, someone who had a tired look, but who carried a silent determination in her movements. She didn't say his name, didn't ask questions, nor did she wait for thanks. She simply placed the small packet of food and a half-full jar of water next to him and whispered just 2 words, with an urgency that made Nicodemus tremble. "He lives." Then she disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a trail of the smell of oil and hope. For Nicodemus, who had spent hours immersed in the sour smell of fear and humiliation, that touch of humanity, coming from a person invisible to the Sanhedrin, was his first moment of true reverence that day. He realized that the system, the law, the power, everything he had built was cold and implacable, but that the faith of those humble people, the same faith he had feared and publicly rejected, was something warm, dangerous, and absolutely sustaining. That bread was not just food, it was a brutal symbol that the establishment that had destroyed him was not the whole world, and that life continued in a way that he had never stopped to truly observe. Nicodemus ate the bread with a shameful voracity, swallowing the lentils as if they were the most expensive nectar, feeling the water clean his throat dry from the tension. As his perspective changed in a way that years of study in the temple chambers had not been able to achieve. He was experiencing life on the most basic level and felt the unique sensation of being sustained by what he previously considered the trash of society. He remembered the glacial coldness on Caiaphas's face when he tried to argue in favor of Jesus, and contrasted it with the risky kindness of that woman. The Sanhedrin had reduced him to dust using the law of Moses, but that woman was living the commandment to love one's neighbor, risking herself to save the life of a class enemy. It was an existential shock for him, a harsh, unvarnished epiphany. He was the great master of Israel who now depended on crumbs, and the ignorant were showing him what true mercy was. He felt a wave of emotion so strong, a mixture of relief and deep guilt, that he had to lean against the wall to keep from crying there, huddled in the dark. The narrator saw that this pain was the pain of the birth of a new faith, which came not from scrolls, but from the street, from the rawest and most real experience of human need. The night dragged on in a tense, silent vigil. Nicodemus, who only slept on Egyptian linen sheets, now clung to the cold stone floor, feeling the humidity rise through his worn tunic. The narrator saw that sleep did not come. Instead, he had an eerie clarity about his situation. Wealth, status, respect, they were all illusions that the Sanhedrin could tear away from him as easily as a dry leaf is plucked. But the fear of being caught, that was real, and it made him hyper-alert. With every sound of footsteps on the deserted street, he flinched, holding his breath. He tried to rationalize, to use Pharisaic logic to calm himself down, but the only thing that came to his mind was Jesus' serene and almost indifferent face, even in the face of condemnation. That was an unbelievable strength, a peace that he, with all his previous knowledge and power, had never felt. He realized that his life, the one he valued, was a fortress of straw, and that true life, the one that really mattered, was this vulnerability he was feeling now, mixed with unexpected gratitude for the kindness of that woman. At dawn, the sun rose with a mocking light that revealed the dirt and disorder of the warehouse. Nicodemus looked at himself, his dirty hands, his disheveled beard, and felt the weight of decay. He had to move. Staying there was risking his life and the lives of those who had helped him. But where to go? He had nowhere else to go. The city that was his home was now a labyrinth of enemies. It was then that he saw, stuck in a crack in the wall, a tiny piece of papyrus, folded in a way that only an initiate would understand. His heart raced with desperate curiosity. He picked it up with trembling fingers. The message was simple, just 3 Hebrew letters, but the meaning was explosive. The name of a small village in the Judean hills, a place so insignificant that the Sanhedrin would never think of looking for him there. These were the coordinates of a shelter, a place where the Nazarene's followers secretly gathered. Nicodemus felt a shiver of wonderment. They knew he was in danger, and they were risking their lives to help him. The reverence he felt was for the invisible network of protection that the man he had helped bury had left behind. It was something greater than the law, greater than Rome, greater than the Sanhedrin. With the adrenaline of discovery and the urgency to move, Nicodemus began his journey. He needed to leave the city before the Sanhedrin's patrols, or worse, the thugs of his creditors who wanted to collect his debts, noticed his absence and started searching the alleys. The narrator watched him walking, now with a firmer, although still hesitant step, his tunic covered in dust and his face hidden under a hood borrowed from an abandoned clothesline. The city, which had always been a red carpet under his feet, now seemed full of curious and hostile eyes. Every face he passed was a potential denunciation. He felt the weight of the crumpled papyrus in his fist, like a profane amulet for a Pharisee like him. He needed to reach the south gate, which led to the Judean hills, a long and dangerous stretch for a man his age, and with the history of authority he had. The feeling of being hunted was a slow but potent poison that undermined his energy and made him wonder if all that opulence was worth the price of the terror he felt now. He remembered the endless debates in the Sanhedrin, the arguments about legal purity, and realized that all that erudition was useless against human cruelty. The walk was exhausting, the village was a good distance away, and the path was full of loose stones, very different from the paved streets of Jerusalem. Nicodemus, who used to complain about small headaches, now had his leg muscles screaming from exhaustion, and the midday sun beat down relentlessly. He felt childishly vulnerable, a creature outside his habitat. Upon leaving the city, he had to pass through an area of shepherds, those Haaretz, again, and felt a strange tension in the air. Instead of the contempt he expected, he saw looks of silent compassion from those who understood the pain without needing words. An old shepherd, with a face full of crevices like an ancient map, just pointed his staff to the right trail and nodded. Nicodemus felt he was entering a new world, where status did not matter, and what counted was simple human decency. It was a unique experience for him, the first time he was seen without his title, just as a man needing help. The narrator saw Nicodemus's face soften with this silent exchange. He felt a deep reverence for that anonymous shepherd who offered him the right direction, an act that was worth more than all the silver he had lost. At the end of the afternoon, Nicodemus spotted the village. It was nothing impressive, a handful of mud and stone houses blended into the arid landscape without the pomp or grandeur he was accustomed to. However, the narrator saw that this simplicity caused an unexpected reverence in him, because it was the only safe refuge in his upside-down universe. He dragged himself to the first house that seemed to have the discreet symbol drawn on the papyrus, a fish, which he vaguely remembered seeing in some secret discussions. His knock on the door was not that of a master, but of a beggar, weak and desperate. The door opened slowly, revealing a robust man with calloused hands who used the direct, non-judgmental look that Nicodemus had already seen in the shepherd. He didn't ask who Nicodemus was, nor did he mention the Sanhedrin or the confiscation. He just said, with a deep, welcoming voice, "Come in, Master. We were waiting." The use of the title Master made Nicodemus feel a pang of pain mixed with immense relief, as it meant that for that community, his identity was not that of a failed traitor, but of someone who had dared to take a stand for a cause. The man took him to a simple chamber at the back of the house, which smelled of hay and wet earth. There, Nicodemus was treated not with the formality of an equal, but with the practical tenderness of someone caring for an injured person. He received a bowl of hot stew, a pot of fresh water, and, most importantly, a safe place to rest. As he ate, Nicodemus couldn't take his eyes off the man. He wasn't an intellectual, but he had an unbelievable peace, a kind of silent strength that came from within. The man, who he later learned was called Jonathan, just sat on a stool, sharpening a tool, leaving Nicodemus to his silence. The narrator saw the Pharisee's face relax for the first time in hours. He felt that true wealth was not in the properties he had lost, but in that protective silence, in that risky hospitality. It was an insane paradox for him. He had lost everything and at the same time had gained a deeper and more real human connection than he had ever experienced in his entire life of prestige. He finally managed to close his eyes, feeling the warmth of the ground and the peace of anonymity. And the last thing he thought was, how did they know? Nicodemus slept for hours, a deep and restorative sleep, without the nightmares of confiscation and persecution that had tormented his waking mind. Upon waking up, in the middle of the night, he smelled the gentle incense, something different from the expensive temple incense. This was earthy and simple, but carried a sense of deep calm. He got up, feeling his bones complain, and saw Jonathan sitting in a corner in silent prayer. Nicodemus, the Pharisee, the master of public and formal prayer, was hypnotized by the devotional simplicity of that man. There were no loud murmurs, no theatrical movements. It was a pure and unfiltered connection with the divine. The narrator saw Nicodemus's face contort with a touch of holy envy. He who knew all the rituals by heart had never achieved that level of peace that Jonathan displayed so naturally. Nicodemus realized, with a shock of humility, that his system of life had taught him to talk about God, but had prevented him from feeling God in that way. He felt a renewed reverence, not for the religious institution he had served, but for that individual mystery of faith that was before him. The crucial question, how did they know, was a weight on Nicodemus's mind. A delicious mystery that he needed to unravel. He approached Jonathan cautiously, feeling strangely shy, like an inexperienced student. Jonathan smiled, a smile that Nicodemus felt soar into his soul, and said that the warning had come through a surveillance network they called the Listeners. It was not an army, nor paid spies, but ordinary people. Bakers, water carriers, and even some servants in the homes of Sanhedrin members who had attentive eyes and sealed lips. Nicodemus, who only trusted messengers with official seals, was amazed by the social engineering of that community. They had an invisible and much more efficient connection than the entire power machine of Jerusalem. Jonathan explained that after Nicodemus helped with the burial, he began to be seen as one of their own, and the care was mutual. The narrator saw Nicodemus's eyes gleam with the discovery. Power was not in opulence and law, but in the simple loyalty and risky sacrifice of people he barely knew. That was the true organization, and he felt an immense pride at having been included in it. In the days that followed, which condensed in Nicodemus's memory as one intense day of re-education, he never stopped observing life in that village. It was an existence of hard work, but there was a simple and unfettered joy that he had never seen in the opulent courtyards of Jerusalem. Children played without the rigid supervision he imposed on his own grandchildren, and women worked side by side, sharing the day's burden with soft songs that sounded more like prayers than music. Nicodemus, who was a master at deciphering the law, found himself unable to decipher the peace of those people. He tried to help Jonathan with manual tasks, such as carrying water or splitting wood, and the narrator saw the shame and discovery on his face. His muscles, previously only used to holding heavy scrolls, burned in protest, and he felt the real weight of work. This was a brutally authentic human experience that his money had always filtered out, and he realized that he had never truly lived, only comfortably existed within a bubble of privilege. He began to wonder about the true meaning of purity. For him, purity had always been a matter of rituals, of washings, and of avoiding contact with the impure, haaretz. But there, he was immersed in the simplicity of life on the land, eating bread broken by calloused hands and feeling a cleanliness in his soul that no ceremonial washing had ever provided him. He saw Jonathan, a man who probably couldn't quote a third of the passages Nicodemus had memorized, living an organic faith where helping others was as essential as breathing. Nicodemus felt the deep embarrassment of having wasted decades pursuing a ritualistic perfection that blinded him to the essential humanity of the law. The narrator realized that the confiscation of his wealth had, ironically, freed his soul. He was being forced to be human at a level he never allowed himself, and the feeling was one of inspiring reverence for the resilience and innate decency of that community. That night, after a day of relentless sun and work that made his bones ache, Nicodemus couldn't sleep. Jonathan had left him alone in the small chamber, and he was immersed in thought, reliving the images of the Sanhedrin, the confiscation scroll, and the darkness of the alley. It was then that something totally unexpected happened, something he couldn't explain even with all his erudition. The light of the oil lamp, which was almost out and flickering weakly, suddenly became absurdly bright, without anyone having touched it or added more oil. The narrator saw the shock in Nicodemus's eyes. The light was not that of a common flame. It was a bluish, almost liquid light that filled the small mud and stone room with a supernatural warmth. It wasn't an aggressive glow, but something that embraced, and along with it came a silence so dense that it seemed to absorb all the sounds of the outside world, even the beating of Nicodemus's own heart. He didn't feel fear, but a reverence so profound that it paralyzed his limbs, a feeling of wonderment that made him think, oh, this is it, this is what the presence is like. Nicodemus did not hear voices or see celestial figures, which, for a scholar like him, was what was expected of a mystical experience. What he felt was much more intimate and personal, an unmistakable sensation of being known completely. It was as if the essence of his soul was being read. Every mistake, every act of cowardice, every moment of Pharisaic pride, but without an ounce of judgment. Instead of the condemnation he felt he deserved, there was only acceptance and a love so vast that it made him feel tiny and at the same time infinitely important. The narrator saw tears silently stream down the rough face of the old master, not tears of sadness, but of pure relief. The reality that there was something greater than the Sanhedrin, greater than loss, greater than death itself, hit him like a lightning bolt. In that moment of intense light and absolute silence, Nicodemus knew, in a way that went beyond logic and scrolls, that the man he had helped bury was alive, and that the life he had lost was absolutely irrelevant compared to what he was gaining on that dirt floor. It was a unique and untransferable experience, which redefined his entire existence. The intense, bluish light went out as suddenly as it had appeared. The silence that accompanied it gave way to the night sounds of the village, the croaking of a distant frog, the sound of the wind in the dry leaves, and the accelerated beating of Nicodemus's heart. He lay still for a long time, his eyes fixed on the familiar darkness of the clay ceiling. The narrator saw that the old master was transformed, not only in his beliefs, but in his very physical composition. He no longer felt the excruciating pain in his legs, nor the suffocating weight of fear that had accompanied him since he fled Jerusalem. There was an unexplained lightness, a deep peace that was the tangible residue of that luminous presence. He got up, walked through the chamber and noticed that the air, even without the light, seemed purer, charged with a gentle energy. The experience was so true and invasive that Nicodemus had no doubts. He wasn't crazy, nor had he dreamed. It happened, and the only thing he could feel was a silent wonderment, the unshakable certainty that the confiscation of riches had been, in fact, a divine exchange of values. At dawn, when Jonathan returned, he found Nicodemus sitting on the edge of the makeshift bed with a serene expression he had never seen before. The Pharisee, who the day before was a frightened and exhausted man, now radiated a mysterious calm. Jonathan did not ask what had happened. The narrator saw that he simply recognized the change in the master's eyes, a depth that only came from a real encounter with the inexplicable. Nicodemus, for the first time in his life, did not feel the need to analyze or explain the event based on the scriptures or rabbinic laws. The truth was in his chest, and it was simple. He had been reached by a reality that the Sanhedrin and all its rituals could never touch. He looked at Jonathan, the simple man, and just said, "I understood, Jonathan. I finally understood what he meant." The Haaretz smiled, and the narrator realized that that smile was the silent confirmation of Nicodemus's experience, a mutual understanding that transcended the social and educational differences of both. With this new silent certainty in his heart, Nicodemus realized that he could no longer stay hidden in the village. It wasn't out of fear, but from an irresistible impulse to openly live the truth he had embraced. He knew that returning to Jerusalem meant the imminent risk of imprisonment, torture, and, at best, permanent ostracism. But the narrator saw in his eyes that he no longer cared about the earthly consequences. The loss of his fortune, which previously seemed like the final catastrophe, was now just an irrelevant detail. He said goodbye to Jonathan with a long hug, a gesture of pure affection that he would never have imagined giving to a man of lower class. Nicodemus asked only one thing, that Jonathan help him get peasant clothes and a simple staff so that he could blend in with the crowd and not attract the attention of the patrols. The journey back to the city, which was previously a desperate escape, now became a silent pilgrimage, a march back to life, stripped of all its former vanity, but clothed in a new dignity that came from simplicity and faith. However, Nicodemus's destiny was about to take a more bizarre and totally inexplicable turn. The narrator accompanied him for 3 days of travel, watching him sleep on cold porches and eat dry bread with gratitude. On the morning of the 4th day, when he was just a few hours from Jerusalem, an unusually dense fog descended upon the path, a cold haze that was not common at that time of year. Nicodemus, who was accustomed to the climates, stopped, feeling a mysterious chill run up his spine. As he waited for the fog to pass, he heard the gallop of a horse approaching. It was a messenger, dressed in the colors of one of his former properties, and the man looked desperate and confused. He hastily dismounted, and without recognizing the old disguised Pharisee, began to speak loudly about an insane turnaround in Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin had issued a new edict. The confiscation of all of Nicodemus's property had been mysteriously revoked by an order coming from Rome, from a procurator whom no one could identify, and everyone was in panic about having to return everything. Nicodemus felt his heart pound. The mystery only grew. Nicodemus, the Pharisee, who had lost and then found peace again on the dirt floor, received the news of the revocation of the confiscation with an incredible calmness for a man who had just had his fortune returned. The narrator saw that the shine in his eyes was not of greed or material relief, but of a serene awe. He realized that that event was a direct extension of the mysterious experience he had in Jonathan's chamber, a physical proof that there was an invisible force operating in his favor, and that this force was completely indifferent to the decrees of Caiaphas or the Sanhedrin. The messenger, who continued rambling about the chaos in Jerusalem and the legal confusion that the Roman order had caused, did not notice the subtle smile on the old man's face. Nicodemus felt that the fortune, which he had learned to despise, in his brief life as a fugitive, was returning to him, but now with a totally new purpose. He would not return to his properties as the Nicodemus of before, the man enslaved by prestige, but as a detached guardian of resources that he would use for the good of that network of listeners who saved him. He finally entered Jerusalem, mixed with the peasants, with the rustic staff in his hand, feeling the same peace he had found in the village. The return was anticlimactic in terms of spectacle, but monumental for his soul. The Sanhedrin was in complete pandemonium. The people and creditors who had tried to plunder his goods were being forced to return everything, and the legal chaos was a public humiliation for Caiaphas. Nicodemus, now back in his home, which still smelled of fear but which he now saw with different eyes, did not seek revenge. He did not speak out, nor did he try to reclaim his place in the Sanhedrin. The narrator observed that he was uninterested in the power game, his experience of a single day, the brutal loss, the mysterious help, the blue light, and the inexplicable return of his wealth, had ejected him permanently from the system. He now lived as a Pharisee disguised as a follower, maintaining his position to act behind the scenes, using his influence and later his money to protect and sustain the community that had welcomed him. The thing simply stopped happening as quickly as it started, leaving Nicodemus with the silent certainty that he had participated in something greater than history, something that he did not need to explain to know that it was real. Nicodemus's life from that day on became a work of art of dissimulation. He maintained the facade of a respectable Pharisee, participated in the rituals, but the narrator saw that the spark in his eyes was different, charged with a silent secret. He never told anyone in the Sanhedrin about the bluish light or about Jonathan's network. The experience was his, personal and untransferable. The money, once the source of his pride, now flowed discreetly, watering the needs of the listeners, providing shelter and food for those the Sanhedrin hunted. He became a legendary and anonymous figure within the community of the Nazarene's followers, the secret benefactor who appeared and disappeared in times of crisis, always with a practical and silent solution. In the eyes of his former colleagues, he was just Nicodemus, who had gotten away with it through luck or some Roman intrigue. They never even considered that he had become an integral part of the movement they were trying to crush, and that blindness was his final protection. The most emblematic thing of all was that Nicodemus was never able to explain the revocation of the confiscation. The Roman messenger who supposedly issued the order simply vanished from the records, and the whole legal situation seemed like a bizarre mistake of the imperial bureaucracy, which the Sanhedrin, out of shame, let go. The narrator knew, and Nicodemus himself knew in his heart, that this had been the invisible hand of the same force that lit the lamp in Jonathan's chamber. He lived the rest of his days with that constant doubt and absolute certainty mixed together. He had gone through a real human experience where he lost everything material and gained everything spiritual, and the universe had, in a mysterious and unusual way, returned the shell so that he could protect the kernel. It was a credible and human account of how power can try to destroy, but the immense mystery of faith always finds a way to protect what is essential. The story stopped there, without great philosophical conclusions, just with the serene peace of a man who survived the day of the confiscation of riches and flourished in his loss. May the story end here, but the strength remain within us. We call for an invisible cloak of protection so that nothing we have heard may afflict us. May the power of faith guard us from all evil, visible or hidden. We are safe. Amen.